and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Michael Simmons, the Spectator's economics editor, and this is our omnibus edition where we bring you all the shows we've produced this week. But before we get started, let's take a look at what was in the magazine. This week, Spectator legend Ross Clark writes the cover of the magazine, which is Chambers of Horrors, and this is about a particular legal court, a particular legal group, who are behind many of the cases that we know irk Spectator readers. The Spectator shop is open too. You can browse our range of merch just below the video. Now, on with the show. Professor John Mearsheimer joined Freddy Gray to discuss Iran, the foreign policy blob, and Trump's policy in the Middle East.
John, thank you very much for coming on. I think I may have got you under false pretenses, but only slightly, because we are going to talk about Iran in a moment. But I thought I would start, since we are just marking this centenary of days of the second Trump administration, by asking you to mark out of grades A, B, C, D, and E, Donald Trump's performance on the world stage in his first 100 days in 2025.
I think, Freddie, I give him a D. I think there are four big issues that he should be graded on. One is obviously Ukraine and relations with Russia more generally. Two would be Iran. Three would be the Israel-Palestine issue. And four would be the tariffs. I think with regard to both Ukraine and Iran, I think his instincts have been excellent. I think he understands, let's start with the Iran case, that it's better to come up with a negotiated solution to this problem and to avoid a war. And he's working hard to pursue some sort of diplomatic solution. So I give him credit for that. And with regard to Ukraine, I think he understands that we have to accommodate the Russians in large part, and that it is important to get the Ukrainians on board and to try to settle this one. So I think his goals in both of those cases are good. I think the execution has not been good in either case. And I think this is due in large part to the fact that inside the administration, he has a clear division on how to approach both of those problems. Furthermore, those problems are almost intractable. So I give him credit for having the right instincts, but in terms of execution, he's not done a very good job. In terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict, I think he's done a terrible job. He's done nothing to shut down the genocide. And I give him an F clearly on that case. And then there are the tariffs. I think that the tariff issue has just been handled terribly. It's quite clear that he didn't have a coherent strategy or a coherent logic underpinning the tariffs. And they've bounced all over the place with regard to, instituting tariffs, then taking them off. And if there's one thing the markets don't need, it's more uncertainty than is natural to those financial markets. And if anything, he's exacerbated the uncertainty. And the economy appears to be doing poorly as a result. So I'd give him an F on the tariffs. This is not to say that we shouldn't have some tariffs. That's not to say he couldn't have a clear strategy involving tariffs that worked to America's advantage, both at home and abroad. But I think if you look at sort of the grand strategy behind tariffs and the ability of or inability of the administration to lay out a clear logic for what they're doing, I think I'd give them an F there. So I think the overall grade is probably a D.
A D. It's quite harsh, I'd say. Just out of curiosity, what would you have given the Biden administration over its 4 years?
I'd give the Biden administration an F.
Right.
The Biden administration was a disaster. I mean, the Biden administration is principally responsible for the Ukraine war. Trump says quite correctly, I believe, that if he had been president, there would have been no war in Ukraine. I think that he's correct. Biden is responsible for the Ukraine war, which is one of the greatest foreign policy disasters the United States has helped cause in its recent history. I mean, just a real disaster. Furthermore, in terms of what happened with regard to the Israel-Palestine conflict after October 7th, basically Biden gave the Israelis carte blanche. He did virtually nothing to prevent the Israelis from executing a genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. This is not to say that Israel didn't have the right, as people like to say, to respond. Of course, the Israelis had a right to respond, but I think the way they responded was morally bankrupt. And I think the truth is that the Biden administration accommodated the Israelis. So I'd give them an F on that too. So in terms of overall policy, I'd give the Biden administration a clear F.
So just to summarize, Trump, some good instincts, but terrible execution so far, and Biden, bad instincts and bad execution.
I think that's correct.
That's correct.
I think that's correct.
Well, let's move on to the Middle East, because quite a lot has been going on, as ever, particularly since we last spoke. We understand that just a few weeks ago, Trump came under quite strong pressure from Benjamin Netanyahu to support Israel, for US support to support Israel in a strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. And Trump waved it away, I think was the way the New York Times report on the story put it. And it's understood that there has been a big division in Trump's national security circles between the Pentagon and within the State Department, between, let's for simplicity's sake call them hawks, such as National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and the doves, including people like Tulsi Gabbard, who's Director of National Intelligence, and it seems perhaps surprisingly Pete Hegseth, the much embattled Defense Secretary. What's your reading of what happened there? How close do you think America was to supporting Israeli strikes on Iran, and how grateful or not should we be that it was avoided?
Well, I believe the Trump administration, certainly President Trump, Vice President Vance, and a handful of Trump's other lieutenants want to avoid a strike on Iran. And I think for good reason. First of all, even if we were to strike, and we're talking here about the United States, strike the nuclear facilities in Iran, it's not clear that we could destroy their reprocessing capability, their ability to reprocess uranium. And that, of course, is the key. It's not clear that we could destroy it. Furthermore, it's not clear that if we destroy it, they won't rebuild it. And in fact, the big New York Times story that leaked and told us what the administration was thinking made it clear that proponents of the strike were of the belief that at most we get a year or two or three where we shut down the Iranian nuclear program, but then they would be able to rebuild it, right? So it's not like, it's just very important to understand, it's not like we can go in there and decisively wipe out this enrichment capability and the Iranians can't rebuild it, right? So when you start thinking about just the military dimension here, whether you can take out the enrichment capability and whether you can eliminate once and for all, a strike doesn't look so attractive. And then there are the economic consequences. You want to understand that if we go in there and take out Iran's nuclear capability, we're talking about a huge target set. We're going to do an enormous amount of damage to that country. And the question is, how will the Iranians retaliate? And if they retaliate by trying to shut down the oil coming out of the Persian Gulf, this will have catastrophic consequences on the world economy. And Trump certainly does not want that. So if you can solve this one diplomatically and you don't have to use military force, it makes eminently good sense to try to solve it diplomatically. So what the Trump administration told the Israelis and the hawks inside the United States is we're first going to try to solve this diplomatically. And if we can't solve it diplomatically, then we'll countenance using military force.
Well, and the person who's been assigned the task of solving this diplomatically is Steve Witkoff, who has been having talks with the Iranian foreign minister in Oman. I think there's another round of talks coming up in a couple of days. What have you understood of how those talks have gone? Is there a kind of solution that can be found? Is the solution going back to a Obama-era nuclear agreement that surely would go against what Trump was so proud of in the first term when he tore up that JCPOA nuclear agreement between Obama and Iran?
It's not clear to me, Freddie, there is an agreement here unless we're willing to go back to, let's call it an improved version of the JCPOA. The key issue on the table has to do with nuclear enrichment or enrichment of uranium. The Iranians have a significant capability to enrich uranium, and that means they can make weapons grade material. And the problem with the JCPOA from the Israelis' point of view and the Hawks' point of view in the United States is that it allowed the Iranians to keep their nuclear enrichment capability, their ability to enrich uranium. And what the Israelis want and what the Hawks in the United States want is to eliminate that ability to enrich uranium. And they also, by the way, want to eliminate Iran's ability to reprocess plutonium, which is the other way that you can get fissile material. But the Iranians, very importantly, have made it clear that they are not getting rid of their enrichment and reprocessing capability. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how do you reach an accommodation if the Americans and the Israelis insist on eliminating Iran's enrichment capability and the Iranians say that's unacceptable? It just seems to me there's no deal to be had. So the best you can hope for is sort of what you got with the JCPOA, which is they keep their enrichment capability, their ability to enrich uranium, but you put significant caps on how much enrichment they can do. You keep them far away from where they can enrich uranium to the point where it's weapons grade material. And you have extensive inspections, and you have an agreement that has no sunset clauses. In other words, it's an agreement that goes on forever and ever. And that's the best I think you can hope for if you're the Americans. But for the right-hand side of the political spectrum in the United States and for the Israelis, this is unacceptable. And they demand, therefore, that we go in and we bomb the nuclear sites in Iran. And the question Trump is going to face is whether or not he thinks it's worth telling Witkoff to tell the Iranians that we'll accept a JCPOA-like agreement or not. That is, I think, the issue staring us in the face.
What do you make of the role of Witkoff? Because I think when he was appointed as a Middle East envoy, there was perhaps a slightly anti-Semitic or perhaps paranoid suspicion that he would be a kind of Israel shill. Because in Trump's first administration, Jared Kushner was put in charge of Middle East policy, and he, as an Orthodox Jew, he seemed to be taking a lot of advice from fiercely pro-Israel voices and essentially orchestrating America's foreign policy in ways that made Israel content. Witkoff, it seems, has been willing to push back on the Israelis and actually seems to have wound them up a bit. Is that what you're reading into this?
I think on the Iran issue, everything we've seen with Witkoff, at least in the public record, indicates that he is pursuing an agreement that the Israelis are very unhappy with. He's made it clear that he could live with an improved JCPOA. And in fact, the Israelis and the Israel lobby and the right-hand side of the political spectrum inside the Trump administration have put significant pressure on him to walk back his comments that indicate he might be willing to live with Iran having some sort of enrichment capability. So I don't think you could accuse Witkoff of being a shill for Israel. I think Witkoff basically acts as Trump's alter ego, right? What's going on here is in Trump's first administration, he came in with a very ambitious agenda, and he was defeated at almost every turn. The only exception was U.S. policy toward China. He was able to fundamentally alter U.S. policy toward China by abandoning engagement and adopting a containment policy. But on almost all other foreign policy issues and on most domestic policy issues, he was not able to radically alter U.S. policy. You want to remember that he wanted to have good relations with Vladimir Putin. He wanted to fundamentally alter U.S. relations with Russia in his first term, and he failed. He was beaten back by the blob. He was beaten back much the way Obama was beaten back. So he determined when he came into office this time that he was going to do things differently. And what that meant was bringing in outsiders, not relying on people in the foreign policy establishment, but bringing in outsiders to help him execute his policy. And the two key outsiders that he brought in were Elon Musk and Steve Witkoff, because he could trust them. He doesn't trust Marco Rubio or Michael Waltz as far as he can throw them. They're part of the blob. It's no accident that they've opposed him in good part on a lot of these key issues. That's exactly what he expected. That's why he wants Witkoff. And you'll notice, Freddie, that Witkoff not only handles the Iran portfolio, he handles the Russian portfolio, and he handles the Netanyahu portfolio. He handles three portfolios. And you'll also notice that he has hardly any staff. It's not like he goes places and he has 5 or 6 people with him who are his close advisors. All of this indicates to me that it's basically Trump and Witkoff together trying to figure out how to deal with the blob, which is well represented inside of his administration. But again, both Trump and Witkoff, in my opinion, are willing to cut a deal with the Iranians because I think both of them understand that a war with Iran is not in America's national interest, to put it mildly, at this point in time. But the $64,000 question, of course, is whether they can actually work out a deal and then sell it inside the United States and sell it to the Israelis.
Well, another outsider that he brought in was Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, who was, people might call him a Fox News blowhard and so on, but he's not part of the DC foreign policy establishment blob that you're talking about. And his department, since that visit from Netanyahu, since Trump waved away Israel's push to launch a strike on Iran, a lot of his top team have been fired as part of an investigation into leaks. And it could be to do with Signalgate. It might be that a lot of people are putting 2 and 2 together and making 6. But he certainly is now under pressure, perhaps because he's not part of that blob.
I think he is not part of that blob. I think what you're saying is correct, Freddie. I think that there are 4 players who do not fit into the blob's policy agenda, or do not fit well with the blob's foreign policy agenda. 1, of course, is Trump. 2 is Witkoff. 3 is J.D. Vance. And 4th is Hegseth. You want to remember, Hegseth was the person who came to Europe, went to Brussels on February 12th. This is 2 days before J.D. Vance's famous speech at the Munich Security Conference. But Hegseth gave a speech in Brussels on February 12th. It's a very important speech. It doesn't get that much attention anymore, where he basically said that we are interested in greatly diminishing our role in Europe and pivoting to Asia. Pete Hegseth is a China hawk, And what he wants to do is he wants to reduce our presence, he wants to reduce our footprint in Europe, and he wants to reduce our footprint in the Middle East. He doesn't want to get involved in a war over Iran because he wants to be able to fully pivot to East Asia so that we can contain the Chinese. And of course, this is what Vance, Trump, and I believe Witkoff would like to do as well. So I think that Hegseth is basically with Trump in terms of what to do on Iran. But then we had these purges in the Pentagon, which, to be frank, Freddie, I find hard to read as to what was going on. I've read a number of articles. It's just hard to make sense of how much of this had to do with personality disagreements, how much of it had to do with policy disagreements, and exactly who disagreed with who and what's going on. But a lot of people do interpret it as a purging of restrainers, people who did not want to attack Iran. And that looks to be the case. What that means for Hegseth's views and what that means for the Trump administration's views is very hard to say. If I could make one other point on this, Freddie, at the start of the show, you asked me to grade Trump's actions so far on the foreign policy front. And I think as I laid out my thinking, what you see is that Trump is dealing with a lot of big and very difficult policy issues all at one time. And it's very difficult when you're dealing with different foreign policy issues, right, to keep your eye on the ball and not let other issues interfere with how you deal with a particular issue. So the problem that Trump faces is that if he takes a controversial view on Ukraine, he cuts against the grain. He cuts against what the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and the hawks in his administration want on Ukraine. That greatly limits what he can do on Iran, because he's not in a position where he can go against the majority on two issues at the same time. So I think he's in a situation where he is dealing with two problems, Ukraine and Iran, where there is no obvious solution, and where one can argue that for him to go down one particular road, he's going to pay a significant price. That's going to limit what he can do on the other road. So it's important, I think, to emphasize here that Iran and Ukraine are tied together with a number of other issues as well. In other words, if the tariffs really do great damage on the home front to Trump, that will even limit what he can do on the foreign policy front. So he has a lot of balls in the air here, and some of those other balls may affect the Iran ball.
Yes. Well, it was interesting after Trump's big phone call with Putin that one of the things that came out of it was that they had discussed Iran and Putin putting pressure on the Iranians as well as America and the West. And so it seemed like Trump was almost willing to give Putin a bit of room on the Ukrainian question if he was willing to help on the Iranian question.
I'd take it a step further. I think you're absolutely right. I think that Trump, who again I think has good instincts on the foreign policy front for the most part, wants to have very good relations with the Russians because it will allow the United States to pivot to Asia and deal with China, and it will do something to drive a wedge between the Chinese and the Russians, which is in America's strategic interest. But furthermore, as you point out, we're going to need all the help we can get on the Iranian front, and we need the Russians to help us. But if we don't have good relations with Russia, and we can't work with the Russians to shut down the Ukraine war, then the Russians have powerful incentives to cooperate with Iran. You want to understand that the legacy of the Biden administration is that the United States drove the North Koreans, the Iranians, and the Chinese and the Russians close together. The Biden administration gave those four countries powerful incentives to work together to thwart the United States at every turn. because they all believe they face a common enemy. And what Trump is trying to do is trying to sort of break apart, at least somewhat, that foursome. And he wants to get the Russians moving towards our side of the ledger so that the Russians, again, will help us with China and the Russians will help us with the Iranians. But I don't think he has been successful. I don't think he is going to be successful with the Russians. And the end result is that the Russians are likely to continue helping the Iranians in serious ways.
You talked earlier about Iranian retaliation, and an argument you hear quite a lot from the hawkish elements in Washington and elsewhere is that the last few years have proved that Iran is something of a paper tiger. It has been put under considerable pressure on a number of fronts. Its proxies have been attacked, and it has not really necessarily responded that aggressively. It isn't quite as fearful as has been often made out. I imagine you disagree with that argument pretty strongly.
Well, look, when you talk about what Iran can do, if we and the Israelis strike Iran, we're talking about their inventory of ballistic missiles, their inventory of cruise missiles, their inventory of hypersonic missiles. That's what really matters here. And whether or not you destroy Hezbollah and Hamas has no relation to what their missile capability is. It just doesn't matter. The fact is they have a huge inventory of accurate and deadly missiles that they can use to attack American bases in the region, that they can use to attack Israel, that they can use to attack Saudi oil fields and refineries. They have the ability, I believe, to shut down the Persian Gulf. They can cause enormous amounts of damage across the Middle East with their cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, irrespective of what happens with the Houthis or what happens with Hezbollah or what happens with Hamas. So I think the idea that you're dealing with a defanged Iran, an Iran that can't do much of anything because it's been so greatly weakened, is a foolish way of thinking about the Iranian threat.
And what do you think of Netanyahu's? It's been a very long time now that Netanyahu's been pushing for tougher action, more aggressive action, more violent action against Iran itself. Does it make long-term strategic sense? Is it, as some people believe, an attempt for Israel to topple Iran as a serious regional power and to emerge as the preeminent regional power? And if so, is that necessarily a good idea for Israel?
I think that what you described has long been Israel's policy for dealing with its neighbors. The idea is to turn every country into Syria, to break apart different countries in the Middle East. I believe that ultimately what the Israelis would like to do to Iran is what they helped do in Syria. Of course, I believe the Israelis played a small role in breaking apart Syria. I believe the United States and Turkey played the key roles. But nevertheless, the Israelis were involved. The Israelis are thrilled by what happened in Syria, and they'd like to do the same thing in Iran. They want to break these countries into constituent parts. It's one of the reasons, by the way, Israelis and Israeli supporters have always been big proponents of creating a Kurdish state. When I first came to hear that the Israelis were interested in creating a Kurdish state, I wondered why that was the case. And of course, they wanted to create a Kurdish state because that would involve breaking up Syria, Iraq, Iran, and even Turkey. So the Israelis think that that is a good idea. All of this tells you, Freddie, by the way, that the Israelis are not simply interested in eliminating Iran's nuclear capability. I believe that if Iran were to give up its nuclear capability, were to give up all of its enrichment and reprocessing capability. That, of course, is not going to happen. But let's hypothesize that the Iranians were willing to do that. That would not put an end to the Israel-Iran conflict, because, again, Israel's ultimate goal is a much bigger goal, which is to break that country apart. Now, the question you have to ask yourself, is that a smart policy? I do not think that is a smart policy from our point of view. I do not think that we want to facilitate a war involving Iran that is bent on breaking Iran into different pieces. I think it'd be strategically foolish. I think the Biden administration recognized that. A war with Iran made no sense. And I think Trump understands that. So it's not in our interest. I actually think it's not in Israel's interest. I think that if you look at Israeli foreign policy today, you look at what they're doing with regard to ethnically cleansing the Palestinians, with regard to being deeply involved in Syria, deeply involved in Lebanon, alienating the Jordanians, alienating the Egyptians, wrecking their reputation around the world. I don't see what good this does for Israel. I think Israel is pursuing a foolish foreign policy, and I think trying to break apart Iran into a number of different states or just weakening it in a serious way does not make good strategic sense for Israel either.
I mean, I suppose Israelis would say they're in a tough neighborhood. And they would benefit from weakening their greatest adversary.
I think that Israel is by far the most powerful state in the region when you look at its conventional forces. Secondly, it's joined at the hip with the United States. And number three, it's the only country in the region that has nuclear weapons. The idea that this country lives in a precarious strategic situation is, in my opinion, not a serious argument. The greatest threats to Israel are internal. It's the centrifugal forces that are tearing apart the society. There are all sorts of articles today, and there have been for the past few years, on the potential for civil war inside of Israel. 60% of Israelis, this is Israelis, 60% of Israelis think there's a serious threat of civil war. This tells you that Israel has internal problems that need to be fixed if this country is to have a bright future. So the point I'm making to you is I don't think the external threat environment is the problem here. And in fact, if you look at the balance of power in the region, Israel far outdistances all its neighbors in terms of the balance of power. I think the real threat comes from inside.
What about centrifugal forces inside Iran? I mean, it's clear that there has been a lot of discontent within Iran. The society is not just this simple, obedient, theocratic state. There is resistance to Khomeini and to the regime. Iran could collapse more quickly than Israel, surely.
There's no question that there's centrifugal forces in play inside Iran. But the question I have for you is, okay, what do you suggest we do?
Well, maybe help it collapse, let it collapse.
And how do we do that?
Difficult question to answer.
I mean, the Israeli solution is to bomb Iran, a massive air offensive involving the United States and Israel against Iran. First of all, I think, if anything, that will cause a rally around the flag effect in Iran, and it will work in exactly in an opposite way from the one you're describing. But furthermore, when you get into the business of social engineering on the foreign policy front, Freddie, you invariably get yourself into huge trouble. You want to remember, we tried to do social engineering in Afghanistan. How well did that work out? We tried to do social engineering in Iraq. How well did that work out? We tried to do social engineering in Libya. How well did that work out? I could go on and on.
Vietnam.
I've learned Vietnam, exactly. I cut my teeth on Vietnam. I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War. And I learned in those years that you want to stay out of places like Vietnam. If you think you can go into countries like Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and do social engineering, you're going to get yourself into one well of a lot of trouble. And I would note to you, Freddie, the Soviets went into Afghanistan before we went in, and that did not work out very well. And the British were in Afghanistan before the Soviets, and that did not work out very well. And the French were in Vietnam before we were in there, and that did not work out very well. And oh, by the way, after we left Vietnam in 1975 and 1979, the Chinese invaded Vietnam, and they got their snouts whacked. You want to stay out of these countries. You don't want to get involved in social engineering. And you certainly don't want to get involved in social engineering at the end of a rifle barrel.
Well, that is something, again, going back to your point about Trump's instinct, that's something that the Trump administration appears to understand much more clearly than its predecessors.
Absolutely. I think that Trump's basic instincts on foreign policy, the issues that I know about and care about deeply, are correct. His instincts are correct. It's the execution where you run into big trouble. And execution is terribly important, Freddie, in large part because these are incredibly complicated problems. One of Trump's fundamental mistakes to start with this time around was that he thought that he could deal with the problems rather easily. If you listen to him talk about Ukraine, he thought that he could come in and he could shut down the Ukraine war in a day or two. Indeed, he was talking about shutting down the Ukraine war even before he moved into the White House. Anybody who's studied the Ukraine conflict and U.S.-Russia relations knows that shutting down this conflict and improving relations with the Russians is going to involve a Herculean effort. It's almost impossible to figure out how you can do this. Maybe you can do it, but it's going to be a very difficult task. But Trump was quite flippant in his views about how easy it would be. And he's now finding out it's not easy. And the same thing goes with Iran. And the same thing goes with the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the same thing goes with tariffs. These are really tricky issues. The reason that we rely on experts, and President Trump does not like experts. He prefers to rely on his instincts, as he said when he talked about how he makes tariff policy. He prefers to rely on instincts. You can't rely on instincts. You have to rely on experts because these are incredibly complicated issues. Trump is the ultimate decider, and there's no question about that. And that's the way it should be. But he should be listening to people who have studied these problems and letting them help him figure out how to get out of these problems. But he has not done that.
You mentioned earlier about how one of the difficult things about foreign policy is that it's very hard to keep one's eye on the same ball when there are so many different balls moving around. And this is particularly hard for American presidents and White House administrations. One story that's sort of popped up, really, it's been rumbling for a very long time, but there was this terrible terrorist attack in India and has now triggered a potentially nuclear conflict that Western analysts often just sort of forget about because we're so focused on the Middle East and Ukraine more recently, and perhaps China and Taiwan. But if India and Pakistan go to war, that is a conflict that, does America have any way of trying to moderate that conflict?
It's funny, Freddie, but I was at a conference at Yale on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday that was devoted to India. And right before the conference started, the terrorist attack in Kashmir took place. So I have been thinking, for obvious reasons, about the India-Pakistan conflict over the past few days. Just to buttress your point, what's very interesting, it's hard to find serious discussion of this conflict in the newspapers these days because there are all sorts of other issues like Ukraine, Iran, tariffs, and so forth and so on that dominate it. So this issue has been pushed off to the side in a very important way because not only President Trump, but all of us can only deal with so many issues at the same time. Now, this is a very dangerous situation. These are two nuclear armed countries that have a history of fighting wars. And in the past, the United States has intervened in crises between these two countries to go to great lengths to shut them down. Mainly, what we've tried to do is make sure that the Indians didn't launch a major attack against Pakistan, which would then lead Pakistan maybe to use nuclear weapons. But you don't have the sense that the Trump administration is paying careful attention to this conflict, or that President Trump will intervene in a major way to dampen down the tensions the way previous presidents have, because he's so busy on so many other fronts. So it could be the case, let's hope this is not the case, that this one could spin out of control and you could have a real war, and nuclear weapons might even be used. Because you want to remember, Freddie, if you look at the conventional balance of power between Pakistan and India, it greatly favors the Indians. And we've always feared that a conflict that started off at the conventional level would escalate to the nuclear level, because the Pakistanis would feel compelled to turn to nuclear weapons if they were losing conventionally, which we expected to happen. None of this is to say that in the past or even now a war will happen and nuclear weapons will be used. But the fact is there is real potential for a real war, and there is real potential for nuclear use. And in that kind of situation, you want President Trump, you want the United States to be deeply involved in trying to settle this short of a shooting match. But I don't have the sense that that's what we're doing. Maybe we are, and I'm just not reading about it. Let's hope that's the case. But this is just another example of another ball in the air.
Well, I wonder if you were pretty down on tariffs earlier, but I wonder if this is an area where tariffs can give America substantial negotiating leverage. I mean, J.D. Vance visited India last week. Yet last night, Trump suggested that a free trade deal was on the horizon. I don't know whether the situation in Kashmir has been part of those discussions. I don't think anybody has said so publicly. But surely America could say, you might want to hold off retaliating, or you might want to do what we want in this conflict, or this free trade deal that we are now in the process of agreeing will be out the window.
I don't think we would do that. I think relations between the Trump administration and the Modi administration are very good, and we're not likely to play hardball with Modi in the way you just described. But maybe that's the case. I do agree with your general point that although I think that tariffs, the way they were implemented, made no sense, I do think that the possibility of walking back the tariffs does give us leverage over allies and adversaries alike. So I think that we do have some leverage there. Maybe Trump could tell the Indians that he'd give them a real sweetheart deal if he felt they were on the verge of going to war and Trump didn't want them to go to war. But it's just hard to say what's going on with regard to U.S.-Indian relations over the Kashmir crisis at this point in time.
You've touched on China a couple of times. It seems to me, looking at almost everything the Trump administration does, whether it's the war on DEI in Harvard, and that actually involves fighting back against a lot of Chinese influence in American higher education institutions, or whether it's the Panama Canal, the Gulf of America as it's now called, or whether it's Greenland, or whether it's even Iran and the Middle East, and Ukraine too, and of course Taiwan. China is increasingly the main strategic focus, and the Trump administration, all the sound and fury that it makes on the world stage, there's always a Chinese element in its thinking.
There's no question about that. You want to remember what I said about Trump's first administration, right? Only radical change that was made in foreign policy or domestic policy was with regard to our approach to China. Up until 2017, when Trump moved into the White House, the United States had pursued a policy of engagement with China. This was true in Republican administrations and it was true in Democratic administrations. Both the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration played a key role in bringing China into the World Trade Organization, which helped China grow its economy by leaps and bounds. But when Trump came into office in 2017, he abandoned engagement and he did a 180-degree turn and adopted a policy of containment. So Trump has had his eye on China as a potential threat for a long time. And as I said, he also was interested in improving relations with the Russians in his first administration because he wanted to have good relations with the Russians so that we could pivot to Asia and so that we could peel the Russians away from the Chinese, right? So from the get-go, Trump has been very oriented towards containing China. Biden, it's important to emphasize, Biden followed in Trump's footsteps. Biden did not go back to engagement. He stuck with containment. And in fact, you could argue that Biden was tougher on containment vis-a-vis China than Trump was in the first administration. Now, Trump is back to dealing with China. He wants to focus on China. This is what we were talking about when we focused on Pete Hegseth before. Hegseth is a China hawk. He wants to contain China. There's just no question about that. And you want to understand what's happened here, Freddie, is that since 2017, when Trump first moved into the White House, the balance of power between China and the United States has shifted in China's favor. We meaning the United States, is still the most powerful state on the planet. China is clearly number two, but China is closing the gap. And the United States lives in mortal fear that the Chinese are going to dominate cutting edge technologies moving forward. We have a competition with the Chinese as to who's going to develop sophisticated technologies moving forward. And the great fear in the United States is that the Chinese are going to beat us at that game. And that's going to have huge economic consequences. And furthermore, as the Chinese economy grows and closes the gap between its size and the size of the American economy, it takes that economic wherewithal and translates it into military might. So the Chinese military is growing more and more powerful with the passage of time. The Chinese are not only building military forces that will be useful in East Asia, they're also developing power projection capability. They're building a blue water navy. They want a military that can go along with their Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese are imitating the United States, and this really spooks the Americans, and the Americans want to contain China. Again, as I said, this was true of the Biden administration, and it is certainly true of the Trump administration. But what you want to understand is that because we're pinned down in the Middle East and we're pinned down in Ukraine, it's very difficult for us to pivot to Asia. The best example of this, and it's a very important example, is our war against the Houthis, right? The United States has huge numbers of naval assets deployed in and around the Red Sea for purposes of fighting against the Houthis. What's happening is we are expending huge amounts of ammunition against the Houthis that is needed for East Asia. We have large numbers of naval forces in the Middle East that should be in East Asia. It just shows you the difficulty we're having pivoting to Asia to deal with China. And this is all at the same time that China is growing more powerful militarily. And again, this gets back to the Iran scenario. Do we really want to launch a major war against Iran? that will go on for a long period of time, that will necessitate keeping large numbers of American forces in the Middle East for a long period of time, when we have to be principally concerned with East Asia and containing China? And of course, the answer to that is no.
I think what you in relation to China, I think what you're talking about there is what people in your world call the Thucydides trap, which I believe was Allison's term, was it originally? That two superpowers cannot really exist together, or at least one superpower cannot replace another superpower without there being a major war. Do you think that trap has inevitably been sprung? Is springing? Is a major conflict between China and America inevitable?
Let me tell you what my basic argument here is. The Thucydides trap is an argument that Graham Allison laid out, which is different than mine. My argument is that any great power in an ideal world wants to dominate its region. It wants to be a regional hegemon. It wants to be by far the most powerful in its region of the world. And it also wants to make sure that it does not have a peer regional hegemon. The United States is the only regional hegemon in modern history. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. There is no threat to the United States from any other country, military threat, from any other country in the Western Hemisphere. We are a regional hegemon. At the same time, we go to great lengths to make sure that there is no other regional hegemon, either in Europe or in East Asia. Therefore, we went to great lengths to help defeat Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and the Soviet Union. We played a key role in putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history because the United States does not tolerate peer regional hegemons. The problem that we face with China is because it's so powerful, it threatens to dominate all of Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. And that is unacceptable to the United States. And this largely explains why President Trump, when he moved into the White House in January 2017, abandoned engagement and pursued containment policy. And it's why Joe Biden doubled down on Trump's containment policy, because both of them understood that China cannot be allowed to become a regional hegemon. Now, one final point. It does not mean that war is inevitable. With regard to Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, and Nazi Germany, obviously there were wars, world wars, and the United States got involved to prevent those countries from becoming regional hegemons. But if you think back to the Cold War, which you and I know well, in the Cold War, thankfully, we did not have a hot war. It was a Cold War. And the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, and then the Soviet Union disintegrated in December 1991. But it was without a shooting war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Let's hope that the security competition that has now set in, where the United States is trying to prevent China from dominating Asia, ends up like the Cold War and not like World War I and World War II. It's very important, especially since we live in the nuclear age, that we not have a war between China and the United States. But the potential, Freddie, for a war is real because China has a deep-seated interest in dominating Asia. It's in China's interest. And we have a deep-seated interest in preventing China from dominating Asia.
Next, Mark Carney won a surprise victory in the Canadian elections. Michael Martins tells us what happened.
An extraordinary night in Canada. Take us through what we know so far.
So far, Mark Carney is Prime Minister again. He became Prime Minister a few months ago, and he's just done it again. There are a few, I think, seats short of an overall majority. So it's probably likely that the Liberal Party will end up doing a bit of a coalition with the NDP, which is what they had before. So the NDP is the left-wing party in Canada. And ironically, the NDP probably hasn't gotten enough seats to be officially confirmed as an official party in the House of Commons in Canada. So they might be in coalition with an unofficial party so far. Yeah.
And the amazing thing about this, of course, is I went out in January. Michael Gove, our editor, very kindly sent me out there, and I went there. And it was January of this year, a week before Trump took office, and Justin Trudeau had just announced his resignation. And the Liberals at that point were on around sort of 17, 20 points, 25 points behind the Conservatives. Were on course for a sort of Pyongyang-style majority. Pierre Poilievre was therefore tipped at everyone as the next prime minister. And what we've seen remarkably in sort of 3 months or so is this incredible turnaround, both after Justin Trudeau left and then, of course, the threat of Donald Trump. I mean, which do you think was the more important as sort of the rise of Mark Carney in this comeback, which has now sealed a 4th consecutive victory for the Liberal Party?
I definitely think President Trump had a big role to play. I think to have an election during a trade war was it became essentially a race of who did Canadians believe would stand the best chance of standing up and or working with President Trump, and they opted for Carney. At the same time, I think President Trump has this unique ability to catalyze debates, and the other side of the Canadian election was the domestic side, and in that side, I actually thought that Pierre did a much better job of bringing forward this idea of like harmonizing the Canadian economy. Like you can't trade between provinces really frictionless in Canada. And the idea of like lowering taxes, stuff that, frankly, love that for us. But I do think Canadians were much more concerned about how the country and whoever the prime minister was going to be would deal with Trump rather than, the strictly domestic issues that would normally dominate an election campaign.
Yes, I do wonder if this was perhaps single issue election on which the Conservatives found themselves the wrong side. Their whole argument was change. Mark Carney went for strength, strong Canada together. And in that, basically, the Conservatives almost got squeezed out of the election debate and allowed themselves to be painted almost as sort of unwilling dupes or assets of Trump's.
Yeah, I think the Conservatives definitely struggled to get cut through, especially after Trudeau resigned, because Pierre, I had been watching his campaign for the 18 months before, and he had really honed the message on Trudeau. Like he had done such a great job of just really undermining support for him, which Trudeau also did himself with some of his policies. Yeah. But so I think to sort of have almost like the dog that caught the car, like, Trudeau leaves and then what? It didn't seem like he had the same level of cut through. Like, yeah, he was the change candidate, but with so much anxiety in the Canadian electorate during this time, like he didn't bring that sense of stability that I think Carney did. If you just the bare facts of the matter, they parachuted him in. He's a technocrat. He didn't really even have name recognition. In summer of last year, less than 10% of Canadians actually knew who he was. Any other election, those would have been giant red flags. In this one, he came in almost like, he was an insurance salesman. He presented like that at a time when people were nervous.
This is the fascinating thing. So when I was out there in January, I had a lot of Conservatives say, Mark Carney is the ultimate globalist. He is the embodiment of a failed orthodoxy. At the time, the Net Zero banking group, which the alliance which Carney had assembled together of the world's great sort of, if you want to call them this, plutocrats or sort of banking organizations to say about climate change, that was all falling apart. And they said, look, this is typical of the man, which is that he represents yesteryear's wisdom. Pierre Poilievre is the one who's called inflation right in terms of post-COVID. Pierre Poilievre is the one who's been fiscal hawk for 20 years. Pierre Poilievre is the consistent one. And yet what we actually saw was someone who emerged. Mark Carney, he really just ran on a single issue, which was Trump. And he was also willing to sort of, for instance, trade on his credibility while also avoiding the trap of incumbency. So he was able to say, for instance, look, I've been a central banker to 2 centre-right governments in Canada and the UK. I'm someone who is trusted by the world's elite, but also I'm not tainted by the failures of Justin Trudeau. And for me, what struck me, Michael, was how cynical it was in some ways. He wrote a whole book talking about the need for carbon pricing and carbon taxes. And yet when he got straight into office, he kiboshed that straight away. And I think that was so remarkable. And so perhaps we in Westminster often overestimate the importance of consistency. Pierre Poilievre's been one of the most consistent politicians for 20 years, and he's just lost an election he ought to have won by a landslide.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think Carney should win the opportunistic Politician of the Year award. Like to have somebody do this, it's remarkable. And I was skeptical at first because, as you say, he didn't have that track record. But again, yeah, I don't think voters necessarily care as much as people in Westminster do about consistency. Like he can come in and really triangulate on what the one issue is that not just his voters, but like the voters that he squeezed away predominantly from the NDP cared about, and just relentlessly hit that message. And ultimately, I think, like as any election campaign, you'll know as well, like, you know, the last mile is the only one where voters start to pay attention. And it's unfortunate for Pierre because, you know, he was consistent, as you say. He had a strong message for years. And at the finish line, you know, I think Mark was just louder and spoke in shorter sentences.
And of course, at the finish line, Pierre Poilievre has also now lost his seat, we're led to believe. So, yeah, I mean, maybe we'll see a career as a sort of Canadian Portillo, sort of going around in colourful jackets and doing train observations and a TV series, perhaps.
That's remarkable because you have now, so if Pierre is gone from the Tories, Jagmeet is gone from the NDP, Carney's the only one standing of the three big party leaders, and he wasn't a leader like 6 months ago. I mean, it's remarkable.
It reminds me of the 2015 election, actually, and sort of when I think there was sort of a 24-hour period when Clegg was resigning, Miliband was resigning, Farage was resigning. Yeah. So Mark Carney, the great survivor of Canadian politics, having been there for only sort of, 8 weeks or thereabouts?
Yeah. Just the last man standing. Yeah, the best way to become Prime Minister of Canada.
And I wonder now, for instance, you know, the next 12, 18 months or so are going to be really critical because, as you say, I think the Liberals have won around 168 seats projected. They needed 172 to get a majority under the new expanded Canadian Parliament. They're going to potentially have to go to the polls soon, as in not after a sort of full 4-year term. They're going to have a lot of challenges, aren't they, dealing with Donald Trump? Like, yes, now, fine, Mark Carney's won a victory, seen off Poilievre, but also, you know, the problems aren't going away, and Donald Trump's there till 2029.
Yeah, definitely. I think the big issue that they'll face is the U.S. goes to midterms in under 18 months. And if Trump loses at least one of the houses of Congress, which he is projected to lose, he becomes much more focused on the international side. And the closest person that he could talk to on that front will be Prime Minister Carney. And I think at a certain point, like Carney, it's not an election anymore. You do have to govern, and taking as strong of a line of Canada's not for sale, that type of thing, with President Trump, it might just provoke him.
Freddy's back with Victor Hanson this time to talk Trump, tariffs and trade.
This term counter-revolution, you've used it in your writing about the second Trump presidency. What exactly do you mean by it?
Well, it's not a revolution. It's not taking us away from norms. The people who are conducting it have called it a return to common sense or a return to the center. But specifically, it's an attempt to roll back the cultural, economic, political, military, diplomatic, social extremism of the last, I guess you would call it the quarter century. Basically, we're going back in cultural terms to kind of a consensus of the Bushes and the Clintons that we were normative, and although MAGA is much different than them. But no other Republican has ever thought that they would address the national debt, the budget deficit, the trade deficit, the woke movement, the DEI movement, the ESG movement, the universities, the border, the deportations, all at once. I don't think Reagan didn't do it even in his revolution, to rebound the American economy and win the Cold War. The two Bushes didn't try it. Romney and McCain didn't run on it. So even Trump in his first administration, for a lot of it, it was very orthodox Republicanism. This is very different. This is an ambitious agenda to undo a lot of the things of the last 25 years. Some of them we felt were settled. Nobody ever thought you could say that transgendered biological men couldn't compete in women's sports anymore. Nobody thought you could still in the 21st century deport people who had come here illegally. That was sort of taboo in the Western world.
Mm. I mean, you touched on the transgender issue there. I think one of the, for Trump supporters and for a lot of independents too, one of the big most prominent policies has been this war on the multi-headed monsters of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. How much success do you think he has had? Is it too early to start talking about success? And what are the chances of him winning his war on these various fronts?
Yeah. Well, I think he's at the cusp, and it could go either way. He's got some spectacular successes on the border. We were told that you could not close the border. You had to have comprehensive immigration legislation. That didn't turn out to be true. The border is closed now. There is almost no entries. The biggest problem is how to go about deporting 10 to 12 million people who came in illegally on top of the 20 million that were here illegally prior to the Biden years. And we have a kind of a strange legalistic argument used by the left, and that is, while it's lawful to let in mass people illegally, it's unlawful to follow the law and send them back collectively. They have to be individually adjudicated, they said. So that's a mixed bag. Great on the border. It's lawfare waged on the deportations. Foreign policy, I think it's pretty good. I mean, the prior administration was give Ukraine whatever it takes, endless Stalingrad, Verdun, Somme strategy. And I think now the president is starting to learn that the real obstacle will be Vladimir Putin. And he's talked about a secondary boycott of people who buy fossil fuels from Russia. So I think you'll see some movement there. I think you'll see Iran is in a very different position than the last half century. Its surrogates are all neutered: Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas, the Assad regime. It's being choked by the maximum pressure embargo. And I think they're going to give it a last chance to negotiate. I don't have much confidence in that. And if they don't negotiate, they don't really have an air defense system anymore. And somebody will take it out by the end of the year. So the foreign policy is pretty good. The biggest issue, of course, is the trade war. And I think that as long as the president had stick to these principles of reciprocity, symmetry, and reducing the $1.2 trillion trade deficit and 50 years of consecutive deficits, he had public support. But there's really only about 7 entities. He talks about 70 people, 90. It's only 7 entities that account for that deficit. And it's mostly the 300 billion from China, the 240 from the EU, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, probably 150, 200 billion. And then Canada and Mexico together, about 250 billion. And that's about it. But when he goes into another realm, then I think that has hurt him and accounts for some of the poll slippage of 3 or 4 points. And those are 2 areas. When he says he's going to have a blanket tariff, and that country in particular is running a deficit with us, and I'm talking now about the UK or Australia to take 2 examples, or Israel, that loses public support. They think, why would you tariff the Brits or the Australians, who are our allies, when we're already running a surplus on trade with those 2 particular countries? Then the second thing that has hurt him, I think, every once in a while he gets on this cul-de-sac about revenue. Tariffs account for 2% of American federal income of 5.4 trillion. We only get about 70 to 150, depending on the year, billion. But he says if we get a 15% tariff, we could make $1 trillion or $2 trillion over a decade. But you do the math, and it's still only 100 or 200 billion out of 5 trillion. And that doesn't go well with the American people, because they bought into it on the idea of fairness, symmetry, reciprocity as a goal to either lower tariffs or eliminate them. But when you divert from that and say you want to see this as a source of revenue, then it, in the mind of the American, it's sort of price gouging or a quick, it's get rich scheme, and they don't support it. The polls show that.
But what Trump seems to be dangling in front of the American people now is a tax cut, perhaps any day soon, that might alleviate, if not entirely offset, a lot of the pain that might come, particularly in the short term, through tariffs.
Well, the problem with that is, I think, and I support the president, but 40% of American households do not pay income tax now. They actually get, most of them get a credit. As far as the tax cut for tips, a lot of studies have showed 50% of the people who get tips don't report it anyway, because it's easy not to report. So we don't know how big that will be. But the purpose of Doge, remember, we've targeted about 170 billion. I don't think we're going to get up to 500 billion, but the point of Doge was that you could go beyond the renewal of the tax cuts and get more tax cuts on things like people who receive Social Security or first responders or military people. That would be stimulus to the economy, and it would be paid for by a 25% reduction in the budget deficit. But the problem, I think, with that is we would still, after running on trying to have a trajectory toward a balanced budget, we would then basically be zero out. Whatever we saved, we would give in tax cuts. That may give greater growth, GDP, and more revenue in a year or two, but in the short term, we'd still be stuck with this nearly $2 trillion budget deficit. So I think a lot of people think, well, we'll just renew the tax cuts. That's good enough. Just make sure we renew them, and then let Doge cut, and let's see if we can get that 1.9, 2 point, whatever it is, budget deficit down to 300 or 400 billion or four. And so I think what I'm getting at is that slippage is not just the Wall Street hysteria, but it's mixed signals on revenue and tariffs, and it's mixed signals on whether you're a physical hawk and you want to balance the budget, or whether you want to be a supply sider and take a temporary larger deficit in the hopes of getting more expansive growth and future greater revenue.
It seems to me, looking at these first 14 weeks, that the first 7 weeks were this sort of dazzling, dizzying onslaught of executive actions. And a lot of it was quite exhilarating, not just for Trump fans, but for independents and outside observers as well. But the second 7 weeks, I think, have been trickier. And I think a key moment, even though I don't actually think Signalgate was itself as significant a story as a lot of its critics wanted it to be, the fact that an Atlantic journalist, a hostile Atlantic journalist, was included on this text group chat with the top national security team was a major boo-boo, cock-up, whatever you want to call it. And it rather cut away from this sort of image that the Trump administration up until that point had managed to project, which was quite a slick, high-energy, relentless administration. Do you think, obviously after that came tariffs, and that was caused more confusion and chaos and has been a difficult period. I think a fair-minded observer would say it's been a difficult issue for the administration. But do you think, am I over-reading into Signalgate by seeing it as
I think you might be a little bit. I think it's sort of T.S. Eliot's dream and the reality. So as long as this was figurative and you were talking about these, I mean, Elon Musk was on the stage with a chainsaw laughing about cutting $1 trillion. Everybody loved that. And everybody loved the idea that we're going to get even with the Chinese and we're going to get down to zero tariffs. But once you start implementing that and the American media fixates on individuals, so you start to lay off people, and then the network news is saturated with a woman who gets on and says, I work for 30 years, I'm a hard worker, I have 3 children, I'm supporting my grandchildren, and then I've lost my job, and Donald Trump did this to me. And then the next person says, well, I am here illegally, but I've been here 10 years. I'm not on social services. I have a child with paralysis, and now I have to go back to Oaxaca, Mexico. And that was saturated, and that hurt him. And I think a lot of us expected it. I will say that when you look, there's been a lot of writing in the last 48 hours in the United States. These polls that have him down 10 or 8 are really, if you look at Ipsos or the New York Times poll or the Washington Post, when you look at the breakdown of Trump voters, the Trump voters were almost 50% of the electorate versus 48.5% of Harris. But when you see they are only being polled at 1/3, and then of the sampling, and then more importantly, when I see an NPR poll, I remember the last day of the election, the day of the election, they had Harris winning by 4. Washington Post had Harris winning the swing states. New York Times had her up by 3. And so those polls, I think, have to be diminished a little bit. So it's more likely that Trump is polling somewhere around 45 to 46% approval, not 40. It makes some difference. But the other thing that's hurt him is the Wall Street hysteria. And that, I think, is starting to rebound now, in the sense that a lot of 50% of all Americans only have 1% of the market capitalization at Wall Street. 10% own 93% of the stock value. So when you talk to most Americans about the stock market, they don't know what you're talking about. They may have 401ks, the 40% have 401ks, but still it's only 7 or 8% of the value. So what they're worried about is inflation, jobs, the price of gas, and that helps Trump. And more importantly, when you look at the stock market, between May and August of 2024, it gyrated right around 40,000, which was a historical high. Everybody was, I remember they had caps on 40,000. Nobody thought they would ever reach that. So what we're talking really is it's about 41 now. So we're talking about it spiked right after Trump was elected to 44. Now it's back to right before the election, basically, a little bit earlier. And so a lot of people think, well, wait a minute. Who are these people to think that when the stock market prices go really, or investment income goes really high, then that's the benchmark for everything else, and they can say you lost 10 trillion. You know, I work at a factory and I made $21 an hour. They cut back, I make 17. I don't think I have a birthright to $21 an hour. So that I think people are starting to digest that, and the stock market is staging an incremental recovery anyway. So I think you'll be all right. The biggest, I think we could summarize everything is, will Donald Trump in the next 60 days get a big trade deal with either India or Japan or South Korea or Taiwan? And if he does do that, and he gets it down to reciprocity and eliminates some of the deficit, I think you will see some movement by the EU and China. But if he doesn't, and we get into a trade war, he's gonna have some more slippage in the polls. I think there's a 60-40 chance he can get a substantial deal with one of our Asian trading partners, and that will create momentum. And a lot of people will think we don't want to be left out. But right now, I don't have much confidence in the EU and the United States, partly because they run up also a $300 billion trade deficit. And we're talking about deficits in goods with China, but they kind of work around it. They have about a $240 billion deficit with us. As one European told me, we're not really too worried about China because they have surpluses with us, and we then turn around and have a big surplus with you. And if they cancel 50 737 MAX, we would be forced to sell them some of our Airbuses. So, and they don't like, I think they despise Donald Trump every much as the American left. So I think they channel off the American left, and the American left is telling them, I think Jeremy Raskin was very explicit. He said, any government that does business with Donald Trump will have consequences when we come back into power. Now, he was talking specifically about El Salvador, but I think it was meant to warn everybody else.
There's been this urgency. I'm resisting using the fierce urgency cliche, but there's been this urgency about everything that Team Trump has done in the last 100 days. And the way officials talk is very much that if we don't get it done in these 100 days or in this very early phase of the Trump administration, there's still supposed to be there is 1,000 days or so left, then we won't get it done at all. And that is really about the fear of the midterms. This is just a recurring theme in all American presidencies, isn't it? That this first chapter is everything. And if an administration doesn't make huge strides in these first days, then it's not quite a dead duck, but it's not going to make strides further on.
Yeah, and I think it's specifically true of a lame duck president that will not be coming back. Despite the talk of a third term, he's not coming back. So I think they're also channeling the FDR New Deal 100 days of 1933. They're looking at the 100 days of the massive Reagan tax cuts. And they're even looking at George Bush. And remember, he was reelected in 2004, and he was told when he was inaugurated in 2005, he had 100 days, and he tried to privatize Social Security in the first 3 weeks or 4 weeks, barnstorm, and that didn't work very well. And then the Iraq War kind of undid him. Yeah, I think that's the idea. They have to do it quick, because they understand that such a massive counter-revolution, it's going to affect so many people and shock them. They're going to get a they hope temporary decline in the polls. And then these tax cuts, more deregulation, more energy production, $4 or $5 trillion in foreign investment. By the time of the midterms, the economy is going to boom. We've never tried this, really, if you think about it. Tax cuts at the same time of trying to scale down the federal government. Every Republican president, I would think, enlarged. I don't think they quite doubled it, but they almost did. Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. They set the precedent, in other words, for Obama and Biden, because they had no fiscal discipline. And it was like musical chairs, that as long as the music was going, you didn't worry about having a chair. But when the debt comes due, and we're paying $3 billion a day in interest, then the music stops, and you got to do something. And I think every president thought, well, on my watch, the music will keep going, and I won't be caught. And then I think Trump said, they despise me. I'm never going to win over the media, the left, the Democrat, but I'm going to go down as a substantial president and go for broke. And that's the attitude that I gather from them.
Well, that fiscal discipline has been a theme, certainly. But as you touched on earlier, the promises of 1 trillion, even 2 trillion, it's still early days, but we're a long way off that. I think Doge has, depending on which report you read, identified about 150 billion of cuts. Is it actually possible for any president, even one conducting a counter-revolution, to bring down not just the deficit, but the national debt, which is now, 37 trillion?
I'm very skeptical of it. He's outlined $500 billion that could be frozen, that was already approved. That's going to be contested in the court. But historically, and I've written a lot about the economy of the ancient world, medieval world. Historically, when that debt gets so high, there's only 2 or 3 remedies, and they're not good. And one of them is to inflate the currency and pay it back, as we saw after World War I, in cheaper dollars on the part of Germany, what they owed. The other thing, unfortunately, is to renounce the debt. We've seen that in Latin America. That won't happen, I don't think. And then the third is kind of the scariest of all, and I've seen some people on the left mention it, where you appropriate private capital and you give them credit. For example, a 401k over a certain amount of money would then be used by the government to pay its obligations, and they would be given Social Security credit in years. They've talked about that. But all of those remedies are nihilistic, and it's the only chance that we have is to grow the economy and have fiscal discipline, and then pay back, get the interest down. What's killing us right now is that we tripled the national debt, but when the interest was 2%, the actual cost to us was no more than the debt was about 10 or 15 trillion. But when you get up to 5 to 6% on treasury bills and things like that, in some cases short term, it's killing us at 3 billion, and everybody knows it. The left, the only other phenomenon I'd say very quickly is, I don't remember an oppositional party here in the United States that didn't present some alternative paradigm. The Gingrich 1994 contract with America, or Obama was, the hope and changey stuff, but he did have some particulars he wanted to do, healthcare and stuff. I haven't heard anything from the opposition that says either the border was good, we opened it, we got more people in, we want to come back and get more, or we want to do this on the border, or Afghanistan it had to be done that way, or we're not going to do that again, or this is our plan for peace in Ukraine, or this is how we're going to deal with the Iranian nuclear problem, or here's the new Green Deal. I don't know, Green New Deal, 2.0. There's nothing. It's just they look at themselves and they say, we lost the White House, no executive orders. We lost the House and Senate, no legislation. The lower courts will probably be overturned eventually by the Supreme Court. We have no institutional power. We can't run on the 4 years of Joe Biden to return to the good old days, because it was a disaster at the border, hyperinflation, Afghanistan, 2 theater war. We're just not going to run on that. So what is the alternative is either an alternate plan, but they don't have what you guys have, a shadow government. They don't have people. There's no young Obama, no young Bill Clinton that's taking charge and saying, this is who we are. It's AOC or Bernie Sanders, nobody knows, and there's no agenda. And that leaves just a fourth alternative, and that is the reductio ad Hitlerum. Donald Trump is Hitler. He's a fascist. He wore a blue suit at the Vatican. He's gauche. His wife whispered in his ear something. It's every single day to bring him down. It's almost like a suicide bomber. And now they're using the F word in videos, the SHIT word in videos. They're doing kickbot 25-hour filibusters, storming Republican town halls, vandalizing Teslas. Governor Pritzker said he was going to be a disruptor and disrupt everything. So and the idea is that we don't have any positive thing, but we're going to make it so chaotic that the American people will get in a fetal position, put their hands over their ears and scream, make it all go away. I can't take it anymore. And we don't care who caused it, but Donald Trump's president. And they're getting emboldened because they see the polls working in their way a little bit.
You mentioned the swearing, and you've written about this too, that the vulgarity of the Democrats, while they call Donald Trump vulgar over and over again, and undoubtedly there are vulgar elements to Trump, but it's quite hypocritical now on the part of the Democrats, who are adopting this very coarse style to public discourse.
I think it offends the sensibilities of a lot of people. That's part of it. Is it's reflective of a coarseness of our popular culture. When you see, I do podcasts 4 times a week, and we have kind of a rule that we won't use any profanity or vulgarity on this. And if somebody says hell, we get we get letters coming in and say, please don't use that term. So I try to use heck sometime. But the point I'm making is that the podcast, somehow in the last 5 or 10 years, it's entered in the popular vocabulary, this SHIT, FUC. And they even have as you say, I mean, the Democrats now have this UN-FUCK campaign on F. And these are not just podcasters or influencers on the internet. They're elected senators and representatives, and it's been mainstream. It's very crude, and I don't think the American people, the majority of them, buy into it. It's just so that's what they're doing. They understand that they're repulsive, but that repulsiveness they think will be Donald Trump will be a collateral damage victim of it, because it'll just make everything. Those people will say, oh, I don't know who started this. I can't take it, but I have an idea that Donald Trump is the crudest president we've ever had. Therefore, he must be blamed, and get rid of him, or just that is the strategy as I understand it.
When I was young, we always thought of Americans still, and I think this is a sort of British post-war idea of America, as being optimistic, sunny. Obviously, Reagan tied into that when I was young. And then I think over the last 2 decades, it's fair to say America has become a more gloomy place, a more introspective and depressed place in many ways. But what I've been struck observing the Trump administration from outside is that there do seem to be attempts, and the war on DEI, the counter-revolution against DEI, particularly in academia, which is something you know a lot about, is fostering a sort of renewed hope in the American spirit. And it's something that I think foreigners, I know I do, find quite hard to understand. Can you give us a bit of your insights on that? Or do you think I'm just barking up the wrong tree?
I think there's a great backlash that, if I could sum it up in an abstraction, that people are tired of this war on the American past, on past dead Americans at Iwo Jima, D-Day, in a B-17 at this, at Bellawood or at Gettysburg. They're just tired of they're tired of seeing 10, 15 million people trying to crowd in here and then being told it's a horrible place and the founding date has to be changed. So this counter-revolution, actually, the most interesting for me about it is, if you look at the National Endowment for Humanities or the National Endowment for Art, or the people who are being considered, it's a return to classical architecture. And people will say, the FBI building is ugly. Why do we always like the Treasury building, the Supreme Court? Because it's neoclassical. Or they will say, we're going to restore Columbus Day. We don't care. He discovered America. That was an enormous heroic feat on his part. So it's an attempt to recapture our past, our tradition, our values in art and music. And for the 250th anniversary, they're trying to have videos about great battles in America and the heroic. So there's a sense that we don't have to be apologetic anymore. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be good. We're better than the alternative, and we're going to restore that. And that sense, and that appeals to a lot of people because they have family and grandparents, and when I hear every day, and I'm in academia for 50 years, a toxic masculinity, white racism, we're still hearing that all the time from the DE people. And I understand there was segregation in the South and all that, but I always think of, well, I'm named after Victor Hanson that died at Sugarloaf Hill. He was just a farmer, a kid, 21 years old. He didn't bother anybody. He was 6'3", Swedish immigrant family. And he went all the way over to Iwo Jima and fought for 19 days in hell and got killed. Or I think of my father, who grew up on the same farm with him, and he never bothered anybody. We were in the Northern California with there was no segregation. My mother fought to make sure the Japanese, she was a lawyer, did not get displaced. She was only 21. And then they sent him on a B-29, 45 missions over Tokyo. And he was never the same when I grew up after that. And so every family has these stories about what the United States did, or people in the Korean War are trying to help Europe rebuild or stop the Red Army from going across the Elbe River. But the point I'm making is, and then they hear people say, this is horrible, these people were terrible, and they only look at the downside, and everybody said, well, it was so terrible, why are you so well off compared to anybody else, and why are you so privileged? And so I think the DEI, they think it's the left says, well, this is white supremacy, or it isn't. All it's saying is, everybody is a beneficiary of people in the past, and we understand there were, given the time and place, and this was a pre-modern society compared to ours. So of course, a lot of life was drudgery, so they didn't have the opportunities we did for social and cultural reform. But nevertheless, they were better than the alternative, and that's why we're so lucky to have that legacy. And if we don't honor and cherish it, then we're beneath them. And then the other thing is, I think a lot of people are looking at the current culture and they're saying, you know what, you go back and use the values of the present to condemn the past, but you're wanting your generation. They're going to be 50 years from now, people are going to look at you Americans and say, you had 1 million people defecating, fornicating, shooting up, urinating right on the streets of your major cities. You had 1 million abortions a year, 20,000 of them in the birth canal. They're going to go and look at all these things. You let men come in and clobber women in volleyball and boxing and things like that. And I think that's the attitude, that they're tired of this whiny, pampered generation. And I'll just finish this rant by saying, you really see it in the universities. The universities want to fight Donald Trump, but they're like a beautiful, picturesque, mossy rock on a hillside. They look great from the outside, but they do not want to be turned over, because underneath it, it's pretty ugly. All sorts of crawling little animals and mold, everything. They have raised tuition double the rate of inflation once the student loan program gave them a guaranteed $1.7 trillion loan portfolio for their students. The students didn't worry because the government backed their debt. They have charged the federal government anywhere from 40 to 60% surcharges on individual grants when the going rate for private foundation was 15%. In addition to that, they're working around the Supreme Court that said that 2022 decision against Harvard, North Carolina said you cannot use race as a basis for admissions and by extension hiring. And we all know that they have worked around it. They have received $60 billion in the last 30 years from illiberal regimes. And just this year, 500 million from communist China, or 2024, and Qatar. And now we learn that they were partnering with institutions in China, Harvard was, that may or may not have been helping to suppress the Uyghurs. So I could go on and on and on. Separate graduations predicated on race, theme houses that are not themed but racially segregated. They're doing all sorts of things that if the public is aware of it, they're going to lose. And they should just cut a deal and say, we're going to internally reform and we need that federal money. And we'll try to do it. But if they continue this obstruction, the public will find out who they are and what they've been doing the last 30 years, and it won't help them. It won't be in their interest.
A lot of the power of DEI comes from a kind of tyranny of the mind, and people don't think they can think things or say things, and they haven't been able to. And do you think what's changing is that people now are feeling liberated from that, because they have seen that these dragons can be slayed, and in some ways they already are being slayed?
Well, in the case of the university, they have this letter all the presidents are supposed to sign that shows solidarity in obstructing the Trump reforms. But it's very funny that there's a lot of presidents, Dartmouth president, there's some here are not signing it. And the reason they're not is, I think, to kind of transition what you said, they can use the Trump administration as the bogeyman who forced these changes, and then they can internally tell their own faculty and students, well, we have anti-Semitism and we're going to look for it, but the Trump administration made me do this and cancel the Middle East Studies program. And the Trump administration said, no money, no more Saudi money. And the Trump administration said, we can't gouge the Chinese students 110%, and we've got to cut back on the number of people. 300,000 is a little bit too much. We didn't want any of this, but you can't fight them. And so, yeah, I think they feel that they had lost control of their faculty and students at places like Columbia, Princeton, Yale, and they didn't know how, you can't wear a mask. We would let you do it, but they don't want you guys masked at this. And you know what? The Trump administration said, if you go into Columbia and you trash a room and you bully two janitors, or at Stanford, if you ransack the president's office, or you destroy the sandstone columns and you spray paint them, we're just forced to file charges. We don't want to, but they said if we don't enforce criminal law on our campus, we're not going to get federal money. And so I think that's going on. They don't want to admit that, but from my observation at Stanford, that seems to be what they're really doing.
You talked about neoclassical architecture, and a lot of academics, historians, intellectuals and so on like to compare the American story with the story of Rome. Obviously, this is your absolute area of expertise, so I'm well aware I don't know what I'm talking about. But if you were to put America right now on a sort of Roman chart, where in the experience of the Roman Republic would you put it?
Well, I just had a debate with my colleague, Neil Ferguson, at a Hoover retreat about that question. And he made the argument, and I want to be fair to him, that Trump was an Augustan figure, an Octavian, and we were at the end of the Republic, and that he was accumulating power. But I politely disagreed, because if you look at extra legality, it was the lawfare that was waged against him, or it was the effort to get him off the ballot, or it was the raid on his home, or it's these lower court judges that are trying to say they have national jurisdiction beyond their region just to wage a lawfare. But what I'm getting at is we have both sides doing this, but unlike Rome, we have an actual tripart government. in the Republic. What killed the Republic was the tribunal courts were weak, and there was a Senate, but the tribal councils were weak. There was no bicameral system. And then you had two consuls, and so they were often rivals. But the biggest pathology was somewhere, I think you could start it either in 146. I think the best date would be 146, with the destruction of Carthage and Corinth, as they started to accumulate these provinces in the Balkans, in the East, in North Africa. They were wealthier than Italy in terms of natural resources, population, and these consular armies that went out there created little fiefdoms, whether it was Marius or Sulla, and when they came back, they were stronger than the Roman Senate and the existing council. So you had all of these people that were freelancing. It would be as if today the senior NATO commander in Europe had an army at his bequest of 400,000 people, and he had income from Europe to pay for it under his direction. Or there was a politician in the United States that had carved out a territory where he had tax. We don't have any of that. So we have self-correcting mechanisms. And what's different right now is, and I think it's more specific to Donald Trump, we have never had any president without any political experience or military experience and we had Eisenhower and people, but we've never had anybody from the private sector who has come in here. And then we've never had anybody that I can remember that offended the establishment of both parties. Donald Trump's first administration, there were active cabinet members, Rex Tillerson, James Mattis, Bill Barr at times, H.R. Good people, but they tried to either stop what he was trying to do or tried to reinterpret what he was trying to do. So we've never seen this level of opposition. And then more importantly, we've never seen a chief executive kind of been a tribune of the people. He talks like the average person, and his taste. We've never had a president that would want to be seen on TV in a garbage truck, or working at McDonald's, or eating a McDonald's burger, or going after Rosie O'Donnell, or saying that Adam Schiff is now no longer pencil neck but watermelon head. That are going. The iconic scene for me is going into Madison Square Garden. It looked like a menagerie. He came in there. He had on one side Speaker Johnson. He had Joe Rogan. He had Dana White. He had Kid Rock, Hulk Hogan, and Robert F. Kennedy. No one would ever have that assemblage around him, that entourage. So this is all new, and what it really does, and to distill what I'm trying to say, is that it is deeply offensive to our bicoastal elite as defined by the people who usually run our government. They come out of universities, they come out of the corporate boardroom, they come out of Wall Street, and when they look at this guy and who's around him, the orange hair, the skin, everything, they get repelled by him. They get repelled by his voice, his looks, the people he surrounds himself with, his vocabulary. And I think we underestimate that. But for the people, the interior that was the losers of globalization, he's kind of a classical John Ford hero, a Sophoclean character. He comes in and he says, "You don't have the skill sets to solve these problems. I do. I do." And they entrust him to do the unorthodox, and it's crude. And then as he starts to be successful, people start to say, "I don't like his tweets," and that's a hallmark of the tragic hero in our fabled Western mythology. We bring these people in, they start to solve the problem, but they do it in an uncouth way because the establishment wouldn't dare use those methodologies, but they work. And I think the Republicans had got to a frame of mind where they would rather play by the Marquis of Queensberry rules and lose nobly under Romney or McCain than win ugly under Trump. And that's I think is what's going on with the fascists and the assassination attempts and all this craze. The Tesla, there's just a visceral dislike that these people that support him at these rallies, I don't know what the base is, 35-40%, these people should not be in charge of the United States. We can send them to Afghanistan. We can send them. They're good when you need them in Iraq. The white male working class died, I think, at 74% of the fatalities in Iraq and maybe 76 in Afghanistan. They only have about 34% of the demographic. So we were basically telling 34% of the demographic, you're going to go to god-awful places and die in combat, but we're going to also say you're suffering from toxic masculinity and your jobs are going to be outsourced and offshored. And that's what it's all about. That group is the base of support, and people despise that group. They really do, the elite. And I say that as someone who's speaking from a farm outside of Fresno where I grew up, but I work at Stanford University on the coast, and I can see it within a 4-hour continuum, the people at the Bay Area versus the people in the San Joaquin Valley. And it's like, I don't know, it's like two different worlds. They're not even connected.
That sort of poisonous snobbery that you're describing among the elites, it's something in Britain we might associate with the decline of the British Empire.
I think it is, and it's so unusual because our hallmark was we were not going to have the class distinctions that the British did, that had been toxic to the British and had created a lot of envy among the old canon in America was always, if you're in Britain and a working class person sees a Rolls Royce, he kicks it. In America, when a working class person sees a Cadillac, he goes to the Cadillac owner and says, how'd you get it? How much does it cost? Does you have financing? And that was our trademark. But I think globalization of the last 25 years rewarded people that had globalized international skills in the media, in academia, in law, in politics, in the corporate world. And the people who were more muscular, those jobs, or they dealt with natural resources or whatever, those jobs were outsourced offshore. And then we created a rationalization. We said these people were deplorables, irredeemables, chumps, dregs, clingers, and we kind of demonized them. Joe Biden said, well, they can always, when we shut down the mines, they can code. They need to be coders. And Hillary said, whether you like it or not, I'm going to shut down West Virginia. She said that in 2000, the whole mining industry. And they couldn't even, Joe Biden called these people garbage. And so there was a sense of that they were the losers and they didn't really know how to deal with the world. And I guess they lacked the culture of the elite, and they lacked the romance of the subsidized poor and minorities. They just didn't have anything going for them. And so they were demonized as losers. And Trump said to them, I am your revenge, I suppose.
That's all for this week. Subscribe and make sure you tap the bell so you never miss an episode. Until next time.